This is the Steam Deck for people who want a smaller device with an OLED screen. And it's called the Ayaneo Air, and it has functionally everything that you would want out of a smaller Steam Deck, but is actually undone by its hardware on the inside that honestly has me going back to this big bulky thing the entire time. So the vast majority of complaints that I've seen surrounding the Steam Deck are really related to the size of the device as well as the lack of an OLED screen on it. The 7-inch screen on the Steam Deck is the right size, but then you have all this extra space taken up by the joypads, the touchpads, and everything else. The Ayaneo Air is a 5.5-inch screen, so actually not that much physically smaller, but comes in at a much smaller footprint thanks to the lack of extra features that Valve decided were important and that they've had on a lot of their hardware that they've released across the years. But Ayaneo is more like a traditional gamepad here. You've got the Hall effect joysticks, which are claiming that they'll have no drift, which is due to an electromagnetic rocker that should give it a step up over the Steam Deck, which has already seen some joystick drift as it's been released for a few months. But the regular Ayaneo Air comes in at just under 400 grams, whereas the Steam Deck comes in closer to 700 at 669 grams. That is almost 50% lighter than the Steam Deck. This thing is really great to tout around. Portability vastly increased, as well as the screen being better. As mentioned, this is an OLED screen, which does give you better contrast ratios. You have it so that it's set up that its black levels are infinite because it turns those pixels off, whereas the Steam Deck is still stuck with an LCD screen, and as far as I'm aware right now, there's no OLED upgrade. We did do a video where you can change out the screen on the Steam Deck, which you can watch right up here, but again, OLED is something that people really want on a device like this. And then the Ayaneo also has the added benefit of being 1080p. However, that is where the Ayaneo starts to fall apart. There's some hardware choices in here that just are kind of mismatched and make it worse than the Steam Deck. The 1080p screen is not one of them, but it is a limitation in that you're not going to be using this thing at 1080p when you're using it for games. The 1920 by 1080 resolution helps when it comes to reading text and sharpness, but the processors in here are actually not capable of driving any game at that resolution. And then there's also the issue that the Ayaneo screen is slightly dimmer than the Steam Deck at 350 nits versus the Steam Deck's 400 nits, but it is seriously made up for by the vibrancy of the Ayaneo Air screen. It absolutely looks good, and it also has all of the I/O that the Steam Deck has come to be known and loved for, like the micro SD card expansion. It's got a USB-C, headphone jack, as well as all of the trigger buttons that you would want, power button, volume rocker, but an additional USB-C port on the top as well as on the bottom so that you can use them separately. You can charge on one, especially if you're using a dock. You might want to plug it in at the top here, but if you're lying it down, you might want to plug it in at the bottom. It's like a small thing that I'm not upset the Steam Deck doesn't have, but the fact that Ayaneo included it makes me happy. It's very clear that the Ayaneo Air is trying to compete with Valve on the Steam Deck. In fact, they even include software for their own Ayaneo experience, a Docker that you use within the Windows operating system, and it's fine. The launcher, the IS Space or whatever it's called, is okay, but it's no better than just using Steam's big picture mode. It just aggregates all of the games that you have installed on the device and makes it easy to swap between them, but it does include actually a very helpful TDP changer, which will allow you to actually set the processor to full speed, or you can drop it down in case you don't want to be using it that high in order to preserve battery life, as well as things like changing fan profiles. So in that regard, it's actually really helpful, but as far as like an entire enclosed experience, it's not the best solution. And Ayaneo is supposed to be coming out with their own operating system at some point, but not right now. And during my testing, I actually wasn't able to get SteamOS installed on this because the third-party solution that allows you to put SteamOS onto different devices actually had their servers down, and so I couldn't install it during this. But I do presume that there wouldn't be too many hiccups with getting SteamOS running on the Ayaneo Air in case you do prefer that operating system. But as it's pre-installed, the Ayaneo Air that I got has Windows on it, which means I can play Fortnite on it. Checkmate, Steam Deck. But now let's talk about the performance of this. Both in gaming as well as battery life, this thing did not exceed my expectations, which going into it, I knew that this was not going to hold up to the Steam Steam Deck due to the fact that Ayaneo is choosing to use a previous generation of graphics in this as opposed to the RDNA 2 graphics that are included in the Steam Deck. The advantage that the Ayaneo has is that it has a 6-core processor compared to the Steam Deck's 4-core processor, but the Steam Deck wasn't CPU bound in the first place, so it's less of a necessity to increase the CPU on the Steam Deck. It also is a newer generation. The Ayaneo is Zen 3, whereas the Steam Deck is Zen 2. But the fact that the Ayaneo is on Vega graphics versus the Steam Deck's RDNA 2 is actually quite a loss here. So at 720p lowest, essentially every game was just kind of really hard to play. Fortnite, we barely managed to average 30 FPS. In any other AAA title, it was very difficult to get up above 20 FPS average. In light esports titles like Valorant and CSGO, you might squeeze out a respectable frame rate, but this is really going to be a handheld that's made for indie games like Disco Elysium, rather than something that's actually going to be able to play your entire Steam library like the Steam Deck actually can do. So it was a rough experience actually even just testing games on the Ayaneo Air, but adding into the fact battery life, Ayaneo claims you should be able to get up to 2.5 hours depending on the game. They tested out Dead Cells, that's what they got. In The Witcher 3, they got 1 hour and 15 minutes. I got significantly less than that. So in a AAA title like Spider-Man, I only managed 51 minutes of playtime, and then in an indie game like Disco Elysium, I only got 1 hour and 18 minutes, which was what they claimed for The Witcher 3. So even with a lower processing power going into Disco Elysium, with the frame rate capped at 30 FPS, it still could not eke out a battery life that was anywhere near good. I would have to keep near a wall charger at all times if I actually wanted to use this as a gaming device, whereas the Steam Deck, I can get a couple hours and then I'm still able to plug in. And then you add into the price, the Ayaneo Air is starting at $500 for 8GB RAM plus 128GB storage. That's more than the Steam Deck starts for at $400. But the version that I tested was actually with 16GB of RAM and a 512GB hard drive, which was $600, which is actually beating the Steam Deck's price by about $50. And then the highest end edition of the Ayaneo Air is the Ayaneo Air Pro, and that comes with a Ryzen 7 chip, 32GB of RAM, and a 2TB SSD. And that brings your total for roughly $1,200. And that's actually one of the advantages of this, is that there's more expandability in the Ayaneo Air Pro from just the configuration of what you can get from them. But servicing it on my side, I actually found it really difficult to take off the back panel on this thing. Even though Ayaneo says that you can actually put in your own NVMe drive, I didn't even feel comfortable disassembling this, even though I've taken apart the Steam Deck a dozen times, as well as had experience with other PC hardware. This one was hard to figure out where I was potentially going to break it, and so I actually left this thing enclosed, so I wouldn't count on this being as user upgradable as the Steam Deck, even if Ayaneo says you can. And I'm just really sad that I got an Ayaneo Air that happens to be on Vega graphics. I think that's the biggest limitation that's on this device. If they happen to upgrade it to something like a Ryzen 5 6600U that's actually using RDNA 2 graphics, it would be a much better device, both in battery life as well as in gaming performance. But as it stands right now, this is appealing to a very small subset of handheld users who want something that's worse than a Steam Deck in video games, but better in the screen and form factor, which I'm sure there are people out there who exist like that, but I do think the appeal of gaming handhelds like the Steam Deck is the fact that they can competently play your video games, and unfortunately the Ayaneo Air just didn't hit that for me. It's good for specific titles, but as an all-around on-the-go device, the Steam Deck still has the top spot in my heart when it comes to what I'm going to take on my flight to TwitchCon next week. And unfortunately, I don't think the Ayaneo Air Pro is actually going to do much for what the limitations of the Ayaneo Air are. Just because you've upgraded to the Ryzen 7, all that really is going to do you is give you a faster CPU, which again is not the limitation here. It's the GPU that's actually struggling on this device, and so it makes it less of a desirable upgrade to go to the Pro model versus the Air model. However, Ayaneo has created a really great portable handheld. I do love the form factor. I love the design. generation. I absolutely was a fan of seeing this device, holding it in my hands, and I think it's just held back by being on last generation hardware. And especially with the launch of Ryzen 7000 series now, I would love to see what we're coming up with the next generation APUs. But it not being on Ryzen 6000 was a huge miss. I think it makes it so that I can't wholeheartedly recommend you go out and pick up one of these. But if they tweak the hardware, then I would say go for it.